Part 3. The Reproduction and Circulation of the Total Social Capital. Chapter 18. Introduction. Section 1. The Object of the Inquiry. The immediate production process of capital is its process of labor and valorization, the result of this process being the commodity product, and its determining motive being the production of surplus value. The process of capital's reproduction includes, on top of this immediate production process, the specific process of circulation with its two phases. It is the overall circuit forming the turnover of capital, a periodic process that is constantly repeated afresh at definite intervals. Whether we consider the circuit in the form M to M prime, or that of P to P, the immediate production process, P, never forms more than one term in this circuit. In one form, it appears as the mediator of the circulation process, while in the other form, it is the circulation process that appears as mediating production. The constant repetition of the circuit, the perpetual re-emergence of the capital as productive capital, is conditioned in both cases by its transformations in the circulation process. On the other hand, the constant repetition of the process of production is the condition for the transformations that the capital undergoes over and again in the circulation sphere, for its alternately presenting itself as money capital and as commodity capital. But each individual capital forms only a fraction of the total social capital, a fraction that has acquired independence and been endowed with individual life, so to speak, just as each individual capitalist is no more than an element of the capitalist class. The movement of the social capital is made up of the totality of movements of these autonomous fractions, the turnovers of the individual capitals. Just as the metamorphosis of the individual commodity is but one term in the series of metamorphoses of the commodity world as a whole, of commodity circulation, so the metamorphosis of the individual capital, its turnover, is a single term in the circuit of the social capital. This overall process involves both productive consumption, the immediate production process, together with the changes of form that mediate it, which considered in their material aspect are exchanges, and individual consumption, with the changes of form or exchanges which mediate this. It involves, on the one hand, the conversion of variable capital into labor power, and the consequent incorporation of labor power into the capitalist production process. In this aspect, the worker enters the scene as the seller of his commodity, labor power, and the capitalist as its buyer. On the other hand, however, the sale of commodities involves their purchase by the working class, i.e. the worker's individual consumption. Here, the working class appears as buyer of commodities, and the capitalists as sellers of commodities to the workers. The circulation of the commodity capital involves the circulation of surplus value, and therefore the purchases and sales by way of which the capitalists mediate their individual consumption, the consumption of surplus value. The circuits of the individual capitals, therefore, when considered as combined into the total social capital, i.e. considered in their totality, do not encompass just the circulation of capital, but also commodity circulation in general. In its fundamentals, the latter can consist of only two components. 1. The specific circuit of capital, and 2. The circuit of those components that go into individual consumption, i.e. the commodities on which the workers spend their wages and the capitalists their surplus value, or part of it. The circuit of capital, in fact, itself comprises the circulation of surplus value, inasmuch as this forms part of the commodity capital, and it similarly includes the transformation of variable capital into labor power, the payment of wages. But the expenditure of this surplus value in wages on commodities does not form any part of the circulation of capital, even though the spending of wages at least depends on this circulation. In Volume 1, the capitalist production process was analyzed both as an isolated event and as a process of reproduction, the production of surplus value and the production of capital itself. The formal and material changes undergone by capital in the circulation sphere were assumed, and no attempt was made to consider their details. It was therefore assumed both that the capitalist sells the product at its value and that he finds in the circulation sphere the material means of production that he needs to begin the process anew, or to continue it without a break. The only act within the circulation sphere which we had to dwell on in that volume was the purchase and sale of labor power as the basic condition of capitalist production. In Part 1 of the present, Volume 2, we consider the various forms that capital assumes in its circuit, and the various forms of this circuit itself. In addition to the working time considered in Volume 1, we now dealt with the circulation time. In Part 2, we considered the circuit as a periodic one, i.e. as a turnover. It was shown, on the one hand, how the various components of capital, fixed and circulating, complete the circuit of their forms at different intervals and in different ways. The circumstances which gave rise to differing lengths of working periods and circulation period were also investigated. We indicated the influence of the circuit's periodicity and of the varying ratio of its component parts on the scale of the production process itself and on the annual rate of surplus value. In point of fact, if what was principally considered in Part 1 were the successive forms the capital constantly assumes and discards in the course of its circuit, what was considered in Part 2 was principally how, Within this flux and succession of forms, a capital of given size is simultaneously divided, even if to a changing extent, into the various forms of productive capital, money capital, and commodity capital, so that not only do these alternate with each other, but also different parts of the total capital value exist and function in these different states alongside each other at any one time. Money capital, in particular, presented specific features that were not indicated in Volume 1. Certain laws were discovered, according to which major components of a given capital, varying according to the conditions of the turnover, must constantly be advanced and renewed in the form of money capital, in order to keep a productive capital of a given size in constant functioning. What we were dealing with in both parts 1 and 2, however, was always no more than an individual capital, the movement of an autonomous part of the social capital. However, the circuits of individual capitals are interlinked. They presuppose one another and condition one another, and it is precisely by being interlinked in this way that they constitute the movement of the total social capital. Just as in the case of simple commodity circulation, the overall metamorphosis of a single commodity appeared as but one term in a series of metamorphoses of the commodity world as a whole. Now the metamorphosis of the individual capital appears as one term in the series of metamorphoses of the social capital. But if simple commodity circulation in no way necessarily involved the circulation of capital, since it can proceed quite well on the basis of non-capitalist production, the circuit of the total social capital, as already noted, also involves a commodity circulation that does not fall within the circuit of any individual capital, i.e. the circulation of those commodities that do not form capital. What we now have to consider is the circulation process of the individual capitals as components of the total social capital, i.e. the circulation process of this total social capital. Taken in its entirety, this circulation process is a form of the reproduction process. Section 2. The role of money capital. The following subject, i.e. money capital considered as a component of the total social capital, really belongs in a later section of this part. However, we intend to investigate it here. In connection with the turnover of the individual capital, we saw that money capital displays two aspects. Firstly, it provides the form in which each individual capital steps onto the scene and commences its process as capital. Hence, it appears as a prime mover, giving the first impulse to the whole process. Secondly, according to the varying lengths of the turnover period and the varying ratio of its two components, working period and circulation period, the component of the capital value advance that must be advanced and renewed at any one time in the money form stands in a different ratio to the productive capital that it sets in motion, i.e. to the continuous scale of production. But whatever this ratio may be, the portion of the capital value in process that can function at any one time as productive capital is always restricted by the part of the capital value advance that must always exist alongside the productive capital in the money form. What is involved here is simply the normal turnover, an abstract average. We therefore disregard any additional money capital required to cope with delays in circulation. On the first point, commodity production presupposes commodity circulation, and commodity circulation presupposes the representation of commodities in money. Monetary circulation, the duplication of commodities into commodities and money, is a law of the emergence of the product as a commodity. Capitalist commodity production, for its part, whether we consider it socially or individually, similarly presupposes capital in the money form, or money capital, both as the prime mover for each business when it first begins and as a permanent driving force. Circulating capital especially presupposes the constantly repeated appearance at short intervals of the motor of money capital. The entire capital value advanced, i.e. all components of the capital that consist of commodities, labor power, means of labor, and the materials of production, must always first be bought with money and later on purchased again. What holds here for the individual capital holds also for the social capital, which operates only in the form of many individual capitals. But as we already showed in Volume 1, it in no way follows from this that the field of operation of capital, the scale of production even on the capitalist basis, has its absolute limits determined by the volume of money capital in operation. The elements of production that are incorporated into capital are independent in extent, within certain limits, of the magnitude of the money capital advanced. Labor power with a certain rate of payment may be more or less severely exploited, both extensively and intensively. If the amount of money capital increases with severer exploitation, i.e. if wages rise, they still do not rise in relation to the degree of exploitation, i.e. not at all proportionately. The natural elements which are exploited productively, and which do not form an element of capital's value, i.e. soil, sea, mineral ores, forests, etc., may be more or less severely exploited, in extent and intensity, by greater exertion on the same amount of labor power, without an increase in the money capital advanced. In this way, the real elements of productive capital can be increased without the need for additional money capital. Insofar as the latter is needed for additional ancillaries, then the money capital in which the capital value is advanced is not increased in relation to the increased effectiveness of the productive capital, i.e., again, not at all proportionately. The same means of labor, i.e., the same fixed capital, may be used more efficiently without an additional outlay of money for fixed capital, either by prolonging their daily use or by raising the intensity of their application. There is then only a more rapid turnover of the fixed capital, but this also means that the elements of its reproduction are supplied more quickly. Apart from natural materials, natural forces that cost nothing may also be incorporated more or less effectively as agents in the production process. Their level of effectiveness depends on methods and scientific advances that cost the capitalist nothing. The same applies to the social combination of labor power in the production process, and to the accumulated skills of the individual worker. Carey reckons that the landowner never receives his due rent, since he is not paid for all the capital and labor that has been put into the soil from time immemorial to give it its present productive capacity. There is no mention, of course, of the productive capacity that is taken out of the soil. According to this conception, the individual worker should be paid according to the work that it cost the entire human race to build him up from a savage into a modern engineer. What actually happens is quite the reverse. If all the unpaid labor put into the soil to the profit of the landowners and capitalists is counted up, then this capital contained in the soil has been repaid over and over again at an extortionate rate of interest, so that landed property has long since been redeemed by society, and redeemed time and again at that. The increase in the productive forces of labor, insofar as this does not rest on any additional outlay of capital value, increases in the first instance only the quantity of products and not their value, except to the extent that it enables more constant capital to be reproduced, and its value thus maintained with the same amount of labor. However, it also forms extra material for capital, and thus provides the basis for an increased capital accumulation. Inasmuch as the organization of social labor, and therefore the heightening of the social productivity of labor, itself requires production on a large scale, and hence the advance of money capital in great quantities by individual capitalists, we have already shown in Volume 1 how this happens partly as a result of the centralization of capitals in a few hands, without any absolute growth in the volume of capital values in operation, and nor therefore in the volume of money capital through which they are advanced. The size of individual capitals can grow by way of centralization in a few hands, without any growth in their social sum. There is then simply a redistribution of individual capitals. Finally, it was shown in the previous part how a reduction in the turnover period enables either the same productive capital to be set in motion with less money capital, or more productive capital to be set in motion with the same money capital. All this clearly has nothing to do with the specific question of money capital as such. It simply indicates that the capital advanced, a given sum of value which, in its free form, its value form, consists of a certain sum of money, contains, once it has been transformed into productive capital, productive powers whose limits are not given by the bounds of its own value, but within a given field of action can operate differently, both in extent and intensity. Once the prices of the elements of production, means of production and labor power, are given, the size of money capital required to buy a certain quantity of these elements of production, present as commodities, is also determined. In other words, the capital value that has to be advanced is determined. However, the scale on which this capital operates to form values and products is elastic and variable. On the second point, it is self-evident that the portion of social labor and means of production that has to be spent each year on the production or acquisition of money in order to replace the worn-down coins involves a proportionate reduction in the scale of social production. But as for the money value already functioning partly as means of circulation and partly as a hoard, this has already been obtained, and exists alongside the labor power, the produced means of production, and the natural sources of wealth. It cannot be considered as a restriction on these. If it is transformed into elements of production, or exchanged with other nations, the scale of production may be expanded, but this presupposes that the money continues to play, as before, its role of world money. According to the length of the turnover period, a greater or lesser quantity of money capital is needed to set the productive capital in motion. We have also seen how the division of the turnover period into working time and circulation time gives rise to an increase in the capital that is latent or suspended in the money form. To the extent that the turnover period is governed by the length of the working period, it is determined by the material character of the production process, conditions remaining otherwise the same, and not by the specific social character of this production process. On the basis of capitalist production, however, extended operations of long duration require greater advances of money capital for a longer time. Production in these branches is therefore dependent on the extent of the money capital which the individual capitalist has at his disposal. This limit is overcome by the credit system and the forms of association related to it. For example, joint stock companies. Disturbances in the money market therefore bring such businesses to a halt, while those same businesses, for their part, induce disturbances in the money market. On the basis of social production, it would be necessary to determine to what extent it was possible to pursue these operations, which withdraw labor power and means of production for a relatively long period without providing any product or useful effect during this time, without damaging those branches of production that not only withdraw labor power and means of production continuously, or several times in the course of a year, but also supply means of subsistence and means of production. With social production, just as with capitalist production, workers in branches of industry with short working periods will withdraw products only for a short time without giving other products back in return, while branches of industry with long working periods will continue to withdraw products for a long time before they give anything back. This circumstance arises from the material conditions of the labor process in question, and not from its social form. With collective production, money capital is completely dispensed with. The society distributes labor power and means of production between the various branches of industry. There is no reason why the producers should not receive paper tokens permitting them to withdraw an amount corresponding to their labor time from the social consumption stocks. But these tokens are not money. They do not circulate. We see that insofar as the need for money capital arises from the length of the working period, this is conditioned by two factors. Firstly, that money is the general form in which each individual capital must enter the scene, leaving aside credit, in order to be transformed into productive capital. This arises from the nature of capitalist production, and of commodity production in general. Secondly, the size of the money advance needed arises from the circumstance that labor power and means of production are withdrawn from society for a long period without the return of a product that can be transformed back into money. The first factor, that the capital has to be advanced in the form of money, is not abolished by the form this money takes, whether it is metallic money, credit money, tokens of value, etc. The second factor is not affected in any way either by the monetary medium or by the form of production in which labor, means of subsistence, and means of production are withdrawn, without an equivalent being cast back into circulation.